like in terms of who is really in need of this solution? Like, is it a customer who is small, medium-sized enterprise? Is it a customer who maybe they're on an old data center, they're thinking about moving to the cloud for whatever reason? That's the kind of what I want to really get from you to figure out, like, who are the kind of customers that really this would be great for, and why would they care?
Well, that's a great question. Sizing is always going to be an issue with regard to this type of a solution.
Hmm.
Um, and and then of course you're also dealing with what the customer's vision of their IT infrastructure is.
Hmm.
Part of the challenge is making customers aware of what is available through cloud services as opposed to on-prem, and what's possible with cloud services versus on-prem, and that allows them to make different decisions about what they decide to host on-prem and what they decide to host in the cloud. Now,
Hmm.
obviously, they're going to have to balance cost versus versus doing it themselves. But certainly the agility and the speed of being able to deploy applications or test applications through a cloud service
Hmm.
has some appeal to customers. Now, the size of the business is not as much a consideration as it is the type of business. You
Okay.
know, so the type of business, what I mean by that is if it's a static environment, like manufacturing, for example,
Hmm.
they're not really going to have a lot of requirement for cloud services because they have a static environment where these processes run in order to complete their manufacturing process, and that's it,
Okay.
right? They're not building new applications to service different customer requirements or anything like that. Retail is a great example of that. Um, Software development is a great example of customers that can use cloud services where they're actually doing development. Um, Retail is a good example simply because they have seasonal businesses. So generally speaking, seasonal businesses is also a good profile for a customer. So those are the types of customers. Now the size of the
So
companies will
Nigel,
vary.
so just if I can translate into my own words. So
Sure.
basically, I think the perfect customer for this is size put aside because size is not important in this case. But what is important is the ability to scale quickly,
Yes.
depending on sort of the need. Where you don't necessarily want to invest in on-prem infrastructure because you would then have to look for the peak as the sort of baseline versus going with something like on cloud, which can scale with demand and then go down with less demand. Is that sort of what you're suggesting? And that's why
I,
retail is such a good option because like I said, seasonality could be they really scale up in December and they fall down again in January. Is that what you
that's
sort of?
an excellent encapsulation of that type of customer.
Good.
I also think that um, customers that are developing online products are a great example of where they've got their production environment that they're delivering services today, but now um, they have to develop either a new product or a new service or something along those lines. They don't necessarily want to invest in the infrastructure because once the development is done, they're not going to need it anymore.
Right. Makes a lot of sense. Right, like you said, they may be working on a project, and then once they migrate that application, so to speak, to their client, they no longer need for it on their own in their own environment.
Right. Or let's say, for instance, they're doing that 2 or 3 times a year, right? So then they're that that and that window is like maybe a 2 month development. So they really need the facilities for 6 months and not 12 months. And so then now they can pay for what they use as opposed to buying infrastructure that they own outright. It's going to depreciating and all of that stuff.
Hmm. Okay, so basically you have this development house, you have this retailer who's saying, "Uh-oh, December's coming up.
Hmm.
Presumably I have an aging technology that's not designed to scale, and
Hmm.
I don't necessarily have the budget to keep adding to
Hmm.
this infrastructure. So I'm looking for something a little bit more, like you said, agile and scalable and cost effective. So enter hyperconverged HPE, right? Is that sort of what we're saying?
Uh, uh, yes, and we're also saying that you need tools and flexibility within that infrastructure in order to realize that benefit.
Okay.
And that's where enter HPE, because
Okay.
it's the tools like, you know what, invariably you'll find that the hardware components are almost a secondary consideration. It's really the software and the interfaces that where the rubber meets the road. And
Okay.
for example, in the hyperconverged 380, they have a new user experience interface. It's a new GUI that they've developed
hmm
that basically gives you shopping cart style IT provisioning.
So add
So
as you need, sort of.
yeah,
Okay.
as you need, and by uh, basically they've given you, for example, they've included Azure Stack or Azure Pack. Um, Azure Pack is on the HC 250, but they're going to be migrating to Azure Stack at some point in the near future. I think that's going to be in the December time frame, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
Um, but regardless, the idea is that the collaboration between HPE and Microsoft allows uh, the HPE uh, user experience interface to integrate with Azure directly, and it
Okay.
gives a consistent um, management interface for the user, whether they're talking about their on-prem or whether they're talking about in within Azure itself, or if they had a hosted environment from a third party or something along those lines. So that's what the Azure value is there, that they have this consistent interface. So if they need to go out and provision, a development environment, they can do that. Um, and on
Okay,
the
let me see if again if I can translate it in my own head. So
Mhm.
basically, the HPE solution by itself
Mhm.
is, my understanding, it's a virtual infrastructure, correct? Like it's not necessarily like a big box that's just on-prem only, is it?
Well, it's that as well, right? So
It's that as
they're
well.
right. So you have the HC 250 is a two to four node um, 2U system,
hmm
and you can have up to four of these HC 250s in managed under it as a single domain,
Okay.
right? So if you when you click on that the interface that I was talking about, and it's on the HC 250, I think they gave it a different name for some reason. I think it's Instant On or something. Um, but bottom line is it's sort of that same shopping cart type of interface, so that customer or users can provision their environments very quickly. It's built on software defined storage,
hmm
which is their store virtual technology, and uh, it's integrated with Azure and also with VMware. So
So the VR part is obviously VMware, and the cloud part is, so public cloud is obviously Azure. Is that sort of where Azure comes in and makes it easy to be in a
yeah,
hybrid environment?
and I misspoke. It's Hyper-V and Azure and VMware. So on the Azure side, obviously Microsoft would prefer that it was a Hyper-V discussion. Um, and integrating with Azure, but I don't think that that's a an absolute prerequisite. So, because I know I was chatting with somebody from Microsoft about that, and they said no, no, they hope they host. they host VMware VMs in Azure as well. It's not exclusively Hyper-V. So that's good news for the customer because now they have choice.
So, would you say that the customer who would want to go for the solution, do they have something already? Do they have something from HP already in their environment? Maybe it's a converged infrastructure now trying to go hyper converge, or like what do you think is that journey look like, or do they have something else completely? Like what gets them to talk about this particular solution versus let's say Dell and Azure or something? Like do you
That
have any instance on?
that's a great question, and again, it really comes back to that user experience interface that I was talking about.
Hmm.
That is the missing component, and that integration with uh, with Azure and with the Azure Stack API.
Okay, so it sounds like the GUI is really that at the forefront, making it super easy
E-
for users to, like you said, scale up or down, deploy applications or
e-
and
exactly,
and do
and
it quickly
quickly,
and
and
quickly.
quickly.
Right. So this is the perfect solution for someone who, like you said, may have to uh, deploy something really quickly, easily, without necessarily huge IT resources, because this is something that can be potentially controlled by someone who, because of this user interface that's easy to use, presumably, it may not require specialization to
Exactly.
deploy.
That
Okay.
you hit the nail right on the head there, and the businesses that require that type of elasticity, expand and contract as they need to. This is where this type of a solution fits. So,
That's
uh,
great. So I kind of touched on that. Like, so how does it? Because I know, because I also represent Microsoft when
mhm.
we chat, and I know that Dell has sort of married with the whole Keystone Dell server offering, and I'm wondering, and I've also heard that Dell himself was kind of criticizing HP a little bit about suggesting that there's a lack of innovation, a lack of research. Like, I'm not trying to comment on that specifically, but just the technology itself. Like, do you know
Mhm.
anything about sort of its competitors and uh, beside the user interface? Is there anything else that's sort of unique about this particular offering versus the other ones like Dell that make this sort of a compelling offer or a compelling solution?
Candidly, I haven't really considered that in terms of how does this solution stack up with others because I haven't really seen any of the others.
Okay.
So I can't really comment on that. I didn't know that there's always going to be some war of words going on between the
Of
vendors
course.
and in terms of specmanship and all of that kind of stuff. So I mean that's kind of status quo as far as I'm concerned. Um, but at the end of the day, I mean uh, the underlying architecture and the hardware is definitely does play a role in the solution in terms of robustness, in terms of bandwidth, in terms of scalability.
Hmm.
For example, the HC250 and the HC380 allows customers to start with, for example, a two-node cluster, where a lot of the other solutions that I've heard about, it's a minimum of three nodes.
Hmm.
So there's a potential cost barrier in other solutions. So I think I heard that I can't remember who the other vendor was. Nutanix brings some.
Nutanix, yeah. I think they
Yeah.
position themselves like as the premium. This one, would you say it's like it sounds like it's a medium-sized business. That's what it's. I'm looking at the target's customer here, but they're talking about medium-sized enterprise, global, commercial, FED, SLED, OEM.
Right, and yeah, I think medium size is really the
Sweet
sweet
spot.
spot. Yeah,
Hmm.
and enterprise there's a lot of other there are a lot of other choices even from HPE in terms of converged infrastructure. So depending on how far you need to scale this thing, like I mean, four nodes under four HC250s under a single domain. That's basically 16 compute nodes
Hmm.
uh,
Hmm.
and corresponding storage. But what if your compute requirement isn't that big, but your storage requirement is? So there are some puts and takes where that kind of stuff is concerned. But it fits really well with that small to medium size business.
So I have a quick question for you. What are the top three questions you get from customers when you start talking about, hyperconverged? Like, or do they ask you questions, or what are your top three questions? Perhaps maybe that's a better question.
Hmm.
What are your top three questions to get a better assessment if they are a good candidate for this type of technology?
I think that the most important question for customers is what are your, one of the biggest applications is disaster recovery strategy.
Okay.
Um, and a lot of the initial conversations that I've had is leveraging Azure for backup. I
Hmm.
haven't, I candidly, I've not had a lot of customers that need to do that retail bursting to the cloud for, seasonal business and that kind of stuff. That's part of that's part of the story. Uh, but have I come across that directly? No. So far, most of my interactions have been backup discussions, and also
Hmm.
replication, which is another really key element of the hyperconverged solution.
Replication in terms of it creates a backup, you mean? Does that because what do you?
Well,
Sorry,
no,
I'm not
no.
quite
So
familiar.
I treat backup and replication separately.
Separately, okay.
So backup is, I have my data set, and and every night I'm doing my backups, and something goes horribly wrong, and I need to restore the
Restore.
data that I,
Hmm.
that I had. That's backup.
Right.
Replication is, um, I'm going to, at the same time that I'm writing the data on my location, I'm going to send a copy of that data to another location, so that in the event that my primary data center fails,
Hmm.
I can fail over to that other data set, and all my data is there, or at least the majority of it. Now, what happens is, when we're talking to customers about disaster recovery, we're talking about something we call RPO, or recovery point objective.
Hmm.
How much data loss is acceptable, and
Right.
acceptable meaning how much money are you willing to spend in order
To restore your data to
yeah,
whatever. Okay.
exactly, or yeah, exactly. So if I can't tolerate even 5 minutes, or 5 transactions of data loss, it has to be something called synchronous replication, which is an expensive proposition. And anything beyond synchronous, if
Hmm.
it's not synchronous, then it's asynchronous, and then we start talking about in hours. Is it 1 hour? Is it 2 hours? Is it 5 hours? Is it 8 hours? Um, because some customers can recreate information that was lost over the last hour, for example, in transactions or something along those lines.
So Nigel, would you? I know we talked about scalability as in the beginning, but it sounds a little bit
Hmm.
more like it's almost as if it's a security insurance policy, right? It's almost suggest like like you suggested, it's sustainability of data integrity and access to the data that they may have, which let's say critical business data.
Hmm.
Make sure that if something's, like you said, God forbid something happens, knock on wood, they can recover their data from whatever source they may have replicated to, i.e.,
Yeah.
internal, on-prem, and off-prem.
Yeah.
But also, as presumably this helps them with attacks and security. If maybe they're under some kind of attack from, I don't know, ransomware or whatever, they can again get data from other more secure sources, and hence the hybrid solution where perhaps like you have, it's more of like an insurance. Sounds like a lot of it is insurance policy. Hence
That's
this.
a great point, Martin. And candidly, the ransom attacks, that's a fairly recent development in the marketplace, but certainly
Hmm.
something that customers are becoming more and more concerned about. So,
Hmm.
yeah, if you have access to your disaster recovery, because disasters come in different forms, right? It could be,
Hmm.
you know, remember when we had the power grid fail, and then the whole,
Right.
we lost power for blocks and blocks and blocks. That, it's not a natural disaster where, it was a flood or a fire, or
Hmm.
an earthquake or something like that. This was, we lost power in this whole area that got knocked down. Well, if you had a disaster recovery site in a cloud where the data center was in a completely separate grid and all that kind of stuff, not every customer can afford to have a separate site that's in another grid altogether.
That's a very good point. Um, and I think you touched on it a little bit, the ease of deployment. Do you
Hmm.
find that IT departments don't have the skill, perhaps, or the resources to deploy the more complex solutions, and they choose something like this because it is easier to deploy? Or like, what's your sense, like when you talk to IT departments, is that really a big problem, or they're under pressure perhaps to scale down, become more generalized versus specialists in their roles? Like, does that have a factor, or not as strong as the R stuff?
That's an interesting perspective. The marketing fodder is that that speed to market, that time to market.
Hmm.
Um, I haven't had a discussion with a customer about how quickly they can be able to deploy applications and their time to market, all that kind of stuff. But I have seen situations where I see IT departments struggling to provision stuff, and it does take quite a bit of time because it's not just one point. There's a whole bunch of things in the chain that have to be done in order to deploy an application.
Hmm.
Um, and so I get it. I haven't seen it firsthand. In terms of that became the primary requirement. How fast can we do this?
But I think the crux of this, or really the essence of this, is really this ease of mind for the IT
Yep,
professional to
absolutely.
say, I need a disaster recovery strategy. I need to have a plan in place and the technology to support it, because I cannot afford to uh, have my infrastructure down and not to be able to access critical data. And B, if something does happen, whatever that may be, I need to be able to be back in business like immediately, so to speak, right?
Yep.
I think that's really what makes them go for the solution. Everything else is you know
Do you know what?
great, nice, but not necessarily the main reason they would potentially go with this, right?
Do you know a great example of where time to market is critical is especially with things like I'll use Rogers as an example.
Hmm.
Let's say they're launching a new streaming service
Hmm.
for um, sports or movies or something along those lines,
Hmm.
right? They want to do that ahead of one of their competitors to grab the market as quickly as possible. Well, that means that they have to have an infrastructure that's flexible enough for them uh, to deploy first of all develop the application and then deploy it. So that's an example of where speed to market would be critical.
Hmm.
um, Now we're talking about Rogers, so is that a medium-sized company? No,
I
that's a
would say
pretty
that's
big
pretty big,
company.
yeah.
Right? So again, like I don't necessarily have direct contact, but in answer to your question, yeah, I think that the DR strategy is critical. I think that the scalability is critical. I like to think that when we're offering customers this type of solution, sometimes budget is another concern, right? I can't afford to provision based on the peaks as you
Hmm.
described, right? I'm going to provision based on what my mean business looks like,
Right.
and then you know uh, we're
Cost
expecting
savings can be considerable, right?
exactly, and then we're expecting growth, but we'd like to be able to add on that additional capacity as we need it, as opposed to having to buy it all up front. So that's another business driver that comes into play in terms of what technology customers are selecting.
Perfect. You know what, Nigel? I think you gave me all I need for this. I think you gave me a very compelling story to tell. So I just need to then, like I said, summarize it. Well, I think you said it all. So I'm just going to forward this recording to them, and hopefully they can put something together of quality. So
Well,
thank you again for your time, Nigel. I appreciate it.
thank you, Martin. I appreciate that, and anytime.
Awesome. Thank you very much, and have a great Friday.
You too. Take care.
Cheers. Bye bye.
Bye bye.